This one, yeah.
The first speaker is Shindini Chatterjee, who's associated with Ideosync Media Combined as a digital trainer. Their broad interest lies in centering queerness and queer issues while studying urbanism and politics of spaces. Their paper is in the area of gender and urban geography with a focus on queer identities. The second speaker is Dr. Seema Mathur, a social activist, poetess, and writer. She is also an assistant professor of political science at Kalindi College, University of Delhi. Very recently, she's been awarded with Savitribai Phule Samman on 4th January 2022 in Jaipur, Rajasthan. Her research interests are human rights, women's studies, Panchayati Raj, Dalit studies, and Indian politics. Our third speaker is Dr. Nupur Ray, who is also the coordinator of the panel. She is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science, Kamala Nehru College, Delhi University. Her areas of academic interest and teaching include political philosophy, rights in India, debates and dilemmas by Routledge. I would now like to hand over the mic to the chair, Professor Savita, to introduce the panel theme and carry the session forward.
So good afternoon, everybody. This is the last session of the day, and already, as we have spoken about our colloquium, it's a 10th colloquium. It's very important. It's a kind of a culmination of 9 years of our continuous work with young scholars mainly. We're so happy to see so many of you here. This panel is an extraordinary panel. It's a gender panel which is about negotiating public spaces. Negotiating on the basis of gender identities, basically. Because we, in public space, a number of identities negotiate on the basis of caste, religion, minorities. Everyone is jostling. But gender is something that has to work harder because prejudices are so deep and they simply refuse to die in spite of all the policies of the government. The ruling or governing norms basically are based on hierarchy, which subordinates women in particular. So our first speaker today is Shinjini Chatterjee. Shinjini is going to speak on living on the urban edge, Delhi's trans-masculine politics.
Okay.
A lot of people, not to say I'm not denigrating any of you here, but still a lot of people think gender means women. Right? We have sort of transcended that phase, and now gender means a lot more, and we are into the feminist arena of politics, which is called intersectional politics. We have been discussing intersectionality since the very beginning. So the meaning of intersectional politics, which is a gender politics, will be reflected in Sinjani's presentation. So Sinjani has just finished her MA and she's joining us. She's from AUD, is that right? Sinjani, so very, very welcome. Come, start.
Please use the microphone.
This one. First thing is
उसको
that-
मैं लगा देती हूँ. Okay, try it. Yes. Just from MA.
Alright, so my paper is named Living on the Urban Edge, Delhi's Transmasculine Realities. So, as of cis women, but there has been an inclusion of LGBTQ politics within academia and activist spaces. but trans people, transgender people are still very much excluded, and issues are not really coming to the foreground. Even within the transgender identity, it is trans-masculine identity which does not get a lot of stage. So I'll just quickly explain what does trans-masculine mean, and it is a little different from trans men, which is the official term used after the trans bill has been passed. So trans-masculine means anyone who was assigned female at birth and identifies with the gender which is masculine. So it includes all trans men, non-binary people, or anyone. So there's a lot of, like, in that way, sub-identities within it, but it is still the trans-masculine identity because that's what influences their experiences and how they understand themselves. So it's, in a way, you can think moving from a female assigned identity to a more masculine identity, gender identity. So, of course, since I developed this paper during my master's as a partial requirement to fulfill my degree, I'll just mention that there are certain limitations of it because I did not have a lot of time, so I could not interview a lot of people, and of course I need more interviewing skills and knowledge to develop this paper further. But so I interviewed 5 people, and we tried understanding the trans-masculine identity in itself, and how does being a trans-masculine person influence accessibility to public spaces, and can accessibility can it be used as a tool to claim citizenship, accessibility to public spaces. So I briefly explained about the trans-masculine identity, but in the larger context, we need to understand that the transgender identity in itself is constructed at the intersection of medicine and legality. So it was initially sexology in Europe which defined transgender people. And then, of course, a lot of legal controls were asserted on queer people, especially trans women and transgender people, because gender is used as a primary frame of all our interactions, and it was specifically in that history in space that that anyone who deviated from those specific gendered expectations were punished, and in that way excluded from public space. So in the Indian context, it is the there is a need for transgender people to get a transgender certificate, ask for reservation, and residing in a non-normative body influences our experiences of navigating public spaces. So as I was conducting my preliminary literature review, I actually could not find a lot of literature on trans-masculine people. There was a lot on trans-feminine people, and which again came from a medicalized understanding. So I used the literature developed by feminist geographers mainly to understand how gender is used as a primary frame, make sense of our interactions and accessibility to spaces. So we know for a fact that women were not allowed to leave their houses for the longest time, but they could only leave their houses and access public spaces where their labor was. In this case, we are again required for our labor, but we are never the possessors of the public. versus the politics of public. We are just the bystanders. So, all right, I talked about my research methodology. So I basically conducted some interviews, and then yeah. So my research findings. So one of the major findings was that there is a difference between the official legal term versus the term that people identified with. Um, Most of the research participants said that they were trans masculine, but they were not trans men. One of the major reasons was also because of the connotations that comes with identifying with the term, and the way you are viewed in public, and how you understand yourself. Then we looked into the everyday experiences of going out. So it was simply the questions were designed as such, like, what places do you go to? How do you go to these places? So because if they tried using the metro, they would get a lot of stairs, and there's a lot of slurs were hurled at them, and there were questions raised about their gender presentation. So and the ones who actually used public transportation feminized themselves in ways, and they sort of just pretended to be a woman so that they can use facilities. So when you are feminizing yourself, when you're pretending to be someone you're not, especially if you're a trans person, there's a lot of mental pain involved, which is called dysphoria, which is gender dysphoria, the difference between how you identify yourself versus how you are actually seen. So this dysphoria is precisely what created the alienation that we talk about. So because the fact that the spaces did not account for our dysphoria or our pain, people did not feel connected to the larger society, or even their families or friends, because it was just that no one understands me, no one understands what I go through on a daily. So in this case, what does access to public space mean for us? Can we say that we can use the right to city as a tool for collective reclamation of public spaces? The right to city slogan was developed by Henry Lefebvre in 1968, where people who have been marginalized and excluded from the city get to repopulate the city and reclaim the city and make it their own. So I kind of queered that concept, because that concept initially came for people who were economically excluded from the city, and then they lived at the margins of the city. But when you put gender identity into it, or queer that concept, you bring about the sort of exclusion that comes with the people, and you realize but you do not get the support that you need and the care that can be exerted by the city as well. So that was some of my findings. I would definitely like to say there needs to be a lot more understanding in this case, and there needs to be more research at the intersection of class, caste, and of transgender people. And presently we are also seeing that there is a connection that is forming between the citizenship movement in India. So it will be a great source of conversations around the importance of public spaces. Thank you.
Okay, good.
So I'll reserve my comments for the very end of all the speakers. Our second speaker is Seema. She will be talking about
Singing.
all right. So I'll reserve my comments towards the end of the discussion, panel discussion. Our second speaker is Seema. She's going to talk about Dalit feminism in the context of gendered spaces. She will focus more on intersectionality, uh, filling the gaps there.
Thank you, ma'am, and very good evening to all of you. I would like to speak on Dalit women gendered space in context of untouchability and caste discrimination. I would like to speak from our constitution. The goal is equality, justice, and liberty. Most marginalized section is Dalit women because they treated the last person in the society. So they are in very last ladder of this societal hierarchy. So in that context, if I talk that equality means what? Equality means elimination or eliminating all kinds of discriminations uh, based on caste, class, gender, religion, ethnicity, or race or color, whatever we would like. And in the Indian context, gender, caste, and religion. And if we talk about equality, then exclusion is there. Untouchability practiced and caste discrimination when we are talking. So they are excluded from the very past time from the resources which are available with the state in context of politics also. So they are excluded, and if they are excluded, then we are talking about inclusion. So inclusion is what? Inclusion means allowing everyone equal access to services and resources. Include links with diversity and equality. It is important to understand someone's differences and exclusion to include them and treat them equally and fairly. So this is very important. Social exclusion, if we are talking, there are many studies have been done. So I am taking the references from the studies have been done. Dalit women speak out. 500 cases from 6 states have been done in India. And after that, my study, PhD, during PhD, I have done study atrocities against Dalit women. So I took samples of 200 Dalit women. And very recently, I have done one project sponsored from ICSSR. That is for the political participation of Dalit women, how they are invisible from the politics, especially when we are talking about local governance, Panchayati Raj. So in this context, if we talk about Dalit feminism is what? क्योंकि feminism कहीं ना कहीं एक डोमिनेंट नैरेटिव्स तक जहाँ पे एक मार्जिनल सेक्शंस दलित वुमेन का जो है वो कहीं ना कहीं छूट गई, क्योंकि दलित पर्सपेक्टिव में जब हम बात करते हैं दलित फैमिलिज्म में, सो वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट देयर एक्सपीरियंसेस, देयर नैरेटिव्स, कि उनकी खुद की स्टोरीज और एक्सपीरियंसेस क्या हैं इन प्रेजेंट टाइम. तो जब हम इसकी बात करते हैं सो दलित एंड कास्ट प्रैक्टिसेस. So, untouchability, caste in India, study done by Professor Thorat. He find in 14 states he have done the study, and we find that 54 types of untouchability practices are existing in present time. And in my study, I also how to access the water. from the public well or public head pump, and they are not allowed to enter into the temple. They are not access to their own land. One thing is that Dalit women and people from Dalit community, they are not owning their land. They are dependent on the landlords from the upper caste. तो वो वहाँ पर भी अगर जा रहे हैं काम करने के लिए एज अ डेली वेजर्स, तो वो वहाँ पर अलाउड नहीं है. दूसरा, जब वो काम करने के लिए जाती हैं वो महिलाएं, आई एम टेकिंग द एक्सपीरियंसेस फ्रॉम दैट स्टडी, so they are feeling embarrassed by different kind of activities, actions. जैसे मान लीजिए कि जो मॉर्निंग कॉल होते हैं उसमें they don't have the personal toilets in the rural areas in most of the places. तो वो बाहर जब जाती हैं तो लोग जो है जब वो उस समय होती हैं उस सिचुएशन में तो उनको भगाते हैं कि आप यू कैन नॉट डू इट हियर और भागो यहाँ से. सो दैट काइंड ऑफ एक्टिविटी एंड एक्शंस आर अगेंस्ट द ह्यूमन डिग्निटी. So such kind of humiliation with the women are happening. So these lacunas or gaps we can say in feminist discourse have been जो कमी रही है वहाँ पे, तो इस चीज को जो है फुलफिल करने की कोशिश की गई है. इसके एक दिमाग में ये सवाल भी आ सकता है कि क्यों इस पर ज्यादा बात करने की जरूरत है, क्योंकि वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट फेमिनिज्म. सो फेमिनिज्म means we have to address the gender biasness because all women are equal and women are same, so there is no need to talk differently. But I just would like to explain some kind of atrocities, especially maintained with the Dalit women. Like उनका दांत जो है वो अगर उन्होंने कुछ ऐसा किया है, जीभ काट देना, उनको जो है वो सोसाइटी से बाइकआउट कर देना. और इसके अलावा जो मैनुअल स्कैवेंजिंग एंड द देवदासी सिस्टम, इफ यू हैव हर्ड, मोस्ट ऑफ द पीपल आई थिंक यू हैव हर्ड अबाउट इट. सो मोस्ट ऑफ द गर्ल्स हु आर ऑफर्ड टू दिस देवदासी सिस्टम, दे आर फ्रॉम द दलित कम्युनिटी, and in a very early age they are offered to God on the name of marriage. और उनका जो फिर सेक्सुअली और फिजिकली जो एक्सप्लॉइटेशन होता है उसके बाद की जो सिचुएशन होती है, दैट इज वेरी पैथेटिक कंडीशन, क्योंकि उनके बच्चे जो है वो स्कूल में एनरोल्ड नहीं हो पाते हैं, उनके साथ कोई शादी करने को तैयार नहीं होता है. शादी एक बहुत इम्पोर्टेंट फंक्शन माना जाता है उन महिलाओं के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में कि हो जाएगी तो शायद उनका घर बार संभल जाएगा, इस तरह से. तो ऐसी बहुत सारी जोगिनी ऑल्सो इज अनदर नेम ऑफ दिस Devadasi system. And in Rajasthan, when I during my PhD I got that Chira system is there. If you have heard, some of you people. So इस तरह की कुछ अभी तक जो सोशल प्रैक्टिसेस है अगेंस्ट women, especially against the Dalit girls and Dalit women, still in practice. And the most vulnerable practice is manual scavenging. In 2019 it was the study, and some NCRP data says that more than 56,000 women are involved in such humiliating work. जहाँ पे अगर आप इंटरेस्टेड हो तो एक डॉक्यूमेंट्री है बाय मार्टिन मैकबान, इंडिया अनटच्ड. So you can see there women are saying that वो जब इस मेनियल काम को करके आती हैं तो they are not able to eat the food. वो जो स्मेल होती है ह्यूमन एस्केरेटा की जो अपने सर पर वो मैला ढोती है, उसके बाद जो उनका लाइफ, और ये एक अगेंस्ट ह्यूमैनिटी, हाउ व्हाट काइंड ऑफ दिस सिस्टम that one particular community is treated as lower and they have to put on human excreta on their head. तो ये कहीं ना कहीं जो है एक जो मूवमेंट रहा है उसमें कहीं मिस रहा है. और दूसरा context, so many laws are available against such kind of practices, even in the constitution, the article 17, eradication of untouchability, and article 14, 15, 16, all right to equality. But what is happening in the present context? So I have prepared this slide, 3 slides of some news. This is recently 1 year or 6 months, not later on that. So you can see some of लिया था, तो ये तो बहुत वायरल हुआ था ये वाला न्यूज, उसमें उसको इतना मारा गया था कि उसका हाथ जो है वो टूट गया था। तो क्योंकि कभी कभी मैं जब अपनी क्लास में भी ये, क्योंकि हमारे डिस्कोर्स में जेंडर कास्ट इश्यूज हैं, तो जब हम पढ़ाते हैं, सो द 2047 तक इंडिया विल बी caste and class free, based on more secularism. तो इसका मतलब ये स्टेटमेंट अभी भी ये मानते हैं, क्योंकि जब तक आर्टिकल 17 है और other articles which are talking about such kind of atrocities and discrimination based on gender and caste. So it means practices still continuing in the society, and we have to work upon that. And if we see in higher education, there is one study from N. Sukumar, discrimination, caste discrimination in higher educational institutions. So that also talk about how the discrimination is taking place, because as human being, as child, we all have the right to education. Every child has get enter into school or colleges, but how they are denied to get access in the very primary fundamental right. एक और एग्जाम्पल मैं देना चाह रही हूँ कि मिड डे मील इज द स्कीम so that the people, the children from the marginal section that enter into the education at very primary level. So the women from Dalit community, they are making the midday meal, and students are denying to eat that. Create a space to come together, fight against such kind of atrocities, discrimination based on caste, class, and gender, to fight these. Thank you so much.
More slides? You were saying more slides?
No, only 3 slides and different examples.
Just give the.
Thank you, Seema Mathur. Seema is assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, College, Delhi University. Forgot to mention that. The details that you give us, you're going to be very sure that we're taking it very seriously. And this is one group where things are not said for the sake of saying. We try to make a difference too, because this is an important piece of knowledge. It's not your some statement, personal statement. It's a piece of knowledge. So we will discuss it when we come to that time when we discuss it. Our third speaker and the last speaker is Nupur Ray, who is assistant professor, Department of Political Science, Kamala Nehru College, Delhi University, and who has been a very active participant in creative theory colloquium. We have also published her book, which we launched yesterday, under the themes of creative theory.
No,
Not her. Yes.
How I wish.
Whose book did we? Shelter.
Next.
Sorry for that.
Next year.
But if I say this, which means it is coming.
Yes. That's it.
Thank you.
So Nupur is going to speak on the topic. Who am I? Is that right? where do we belong? Politics of space, marginalization, and sex workers in India. So wait for more solid details coming our way.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for putting this all together. Just a little addition that Discourses on Rights in India, Debates and Dilemmas, it's a co-edited volume with Dr. Vijay Lakshmi Nanda, and she's my teacher, mentor. So yeah, so the theme the topic that I choose today is where do we belong? Politics of space, marginalization, and sex workers in India. Now, because the panelists kind of focused on looking at the politics of space, agency, body, and citizenship, so there's certain kind of theoretical layout and framework that I have also tried to put in, and I hope that it will add in, to kind of inform the discourse more. I'll actually start with Henry Lesper's production of space in his concept of everyday spaces articulated lived spaces as a symbolic terrain of intersecting and countering forces of ideologies of capitalism, racism, patriarchy, along with other material spatial practices, concretizing the social relations of production, reproduction, oppression, and domination. In the context of this very significant intervention, the objective of this paper is to analyze the critical in the context of sex work in India. So as we are actually kind of debating about manifest relationalities and deeper relationalities, I wonder how as community and cultures and kind of societies have we actually felt that kind of relationality with sex workers, and are we kind of using terms women in sex work and sex workers and also prostitutes when I'll be mentioning that particular period. Because if I'm mentioning a pre-colonial period, my use of the term sex work will not perhaps do justice, because prostitute comes with its own package. More specifically, I'll be exploring the following themes, which is looking at providing a brief historical trajectory of political marginalization of sex workers or women in sex work through exclusionary politics of body and spatial configurations entangled with sexual moralities as part of the state discourse in India. The paper argues that the trajectory of state responses and also in general the overall discourse on looking at prostitution or sex work is also a trajectory of a process of alienation and shrinking spaces of existence and deliberations, leading to what I perceive as a fragmented and a reductionist idea of citizenship for sex workers or, as I said, women in sex work. In the context of space, the alienation and marginalities extend from actual physical everyday spaces to conceptual notions of social, economic, and cultural terrains. This enmeshed, understanding where we look at actual tangible spaces and then we are looking at more in terms of conceptual and notions of space is something that also became quite evident, when we look phase of community spaces in terms of access to basic resources, health services, livelihood options, and so on. So my contention here is that more or less the discourse on citizenship, and especially when we look at the colonial, because that's where, according to my understanding, is when that begins. This overall discourse is really limited to a very bare survival. We just want them to survive. And that is the idea of citizenship on which they have, so far kind of, been existing. Whereas what I would like to see, and perhaps everyone who is interested in any kind of social justice, gender justice, is the idea of a flourishing notion of citizenship, which actually enables, women and men to live life with dignity, to be able to make viable choices, to be able to have choices in terms of access to resources, in terms of making better decisions. But somehow, we see that the more or less the approach is what again I see it as a clinical approach. It's a very body-centric approach. At the best, well, in terms of relationality, we really want to see them, as disease-free. We want to keep them to the margins so that they're not threat to certain kind of moral and sexual boundaries of the society that we are in, and public health and hygiene for the mainstream. So not really part of what would call as a very robust, just and fair public health discourse. I would also like to argue then for a theoretical argument about sexual citizenship, which according to me would be based on a substantive idea of equality embedded in bodily dignity and reclaiming spaces of political deliberations as sites of agency, choice, and freedom. It entails the idea of ownership of body, which is inspired from Rosalind Pedinsky, the whole idea of ownership. When J.S. Mill said, "Over my mind and body, I am the sovereign," I thought we all forgot and you forgot that it also talks about women. That over this body, this autonomy should be with the woman. The idea of agency, there's a good literature, by Martha Nussbaum and others, speaking of empowered agency, capabilities, where we can take them from this whole bare survival idea of citizenship to the flourishing, substantive idea of citizenship, which I believe is not possible to do all of this in this time. So I'm going to kind of glance upon the key moments, and I will also try to kind of touch upon some policy perspectives. So when we're looking at space politics and gender relations and context of sex work, very clearly three ideas is something that we need to start with. The public-private divide, and I think the audience here is pretty much kind of familiar, but still just to say that the spatial politics in terms of organization and distribution of public spaces, politics of exclusion and inclusion further reinforce gender inequalities, gender-based segregation of moral, sexual, and normative boundaries. 80% of public spaces are still used by men, and according to research, women feel 10 times less safe in public spaces. It is also more suited to the needs of men and supposedly heterosexual family, heteronormative kind of sexuality, but worse. When it is a case of sexual assault or a violence, that is why the question as to where was the woman, where was she? The second question, of course, could be with whom he was and what was the time. So all that came later. But then where? Not that assault or violence happens only in public domain, but that is like really a question which kind of begins in terms of why, because in our minds, in a very subconscious mind, it is still the public domain, which is the masculine, the space of the masculine, and the woman in the public domain is a certain kind of a digression. So we are kind of that anxiety is something which implicates in different ways. Long one. So I'll shift to then spaces. Spaces, yes, I already mentioned about the tangible and looking at in terms of cultural notions, political spaces, economic spaces, and so on. But when we look at sex work, the idea here is, and I hope I just say it correctly, when we're looking at public domain, the spatial politics invisibilizes sex workers. Yeah, invisibilizes in terms of lack of access to resources, acknowledgement and recognition of them as workers, acknowledgement of their labor, acknowledgement of their rights, recognition of their rights. So, invisibilizing sex workers and visibilizing men, of course, that is. But when it is actually in terms of segregated, because we know that there's a certain kind of ghettoization in terms of the space that is allotted to women in sex work, and that is wrong. We see that within those spaces, which supposedly are called as the red light areas, the customers, primarily men, become completely invisibilized. So even in our research and theory, we are not interested, like really, who are these men? We keep talking about in terms of, inko bachana hai, inko uthana hai, but like, where are the men? And women, of course, as Shinjini said, hyperly. A sex worker represents a non-productive heterosexual body as a site of labor, consumed by market in terms of spatial politics. So where do they actually belong? They belong to that 7 feet room which is given to them, and that is exactly, in terms of other caste, class, and other identities. Age is a very important factor. That is why I use women in sex work, because beyond the point, there are also women viable exit options, no acceptability, the space segregation in terms of distancing and alienation. So there is no acceptance. That's why age is something which is a strong factor. Now, to the state discourse. There are different ways in which state discourses have looked at sex work and looked at prostitution and so on. There's an abolitionist view, there's a view of the conservative, there's something in terms of what is called as indifference, there is regulationist, there is confrontationist. We can go on, but if we look at from the perspective of spatial politics, I kind of see it in two ways. One is the public nuisance approach, and the other is the moral order approach. So when we are looking at public nuisance approach, what is our really the assumption that primarily the state discourses at the end of the day can determine what are the moral and immoral forms of sexualities. And by and large, as much as prostitution or sex work can, and it's been one of the many books it starts with, it is the oldest profession in the world. So it might be the oldest profession, but for a long time the state still designates it something in terms of immoral category of sexuality. And therefore as an implication of something which I'm still looking at is that how the body of a sex worker and sex workers are then treated within that. So it comes from a space of moral baggage. It comes from the perspective of something which is the impurity and purity discourse. It comes from the perspective of the idea that it is something which is not something that belongs to very civilized and very cultured and the whole heteronormative kind of understanding of family, and therefore it leads to criminalization. Therefore, it leads to the whole idea that they need to be kind of separated, they need to be segregated. Something that will come in our, when we look at a couple of policies, especially the Contagious Disease Act is a good example, where you just shun the body as a vector of disease because you know that it is easy for you in terms of moral, boundaries. And then the other is, so there's one more factor which happens, and that is something that recently has been spoken about, researched, are the police raids. So we don't want to see them. Cleanse it, sanitize the space. And therefore, it is something which is called as gentrification, is what I try to use it within. Gentrification ye hai that gradually we are going to move out the vulnerable, and those who are underprivileged and in some way also not part of the neoliberal fancy world, pushing out to the margins, and the supposedly the rich and the privileged taken to the center. So in some way, it leads to forced displacement. Now there are arguments which says that, oh, it is wonderful, it's enhancing or whatever, the social mixing is happening and there is a lot more integration in terms of groups and communities, but there's also research which says that no, it's also leading to social polarization. And it's not something which is so sex workers do come within this. During the COVID time also, there were, I had attended a couple of sessions with All India Network of Sex Workers. So there were cases of police raids where pulled out and cleansed. So I use the term sanitize of the whole, whatever the baggage of it. And then the second is the so the post-colonial discourse is largely within the moral order, which is looking at rescue, rehabilitate, reform, right? So then that is really looking from the lens of complete victimhood, which is हमें reform करना है, हमें rehabilitate करना है, और हमें rescue करना है, and that is something which may, I think, slightly has still more space in terms of giving certain space to women in terms of enhancing their agencies and enhancing their capabilities, because then that leads to in the sense of it leads to policies and the perspective, especially the one that came up as laws later, is to give them certain kind of viable exit options where they can move out and they can then be able to sustain themselves and live life with dignity at the end of it. So these are the two, and I know I cannot get into the details, but I have discussed looking at in the pre-colonial period, the time of China, boys who are ranked pretty much the state in terms of working for the state, and they are enmeshed in political and social life. They're actually the highest form of state employees per se. They're also taxpayers. And then you have independent women sex workers, called as Rupajiva. And they are also taxpayers, and in both cases, sexual assault is a punishable offense. So there is a lot more enmeshing. And what is nice is that there is a space of mysticism and eroticism. And there is more to the body. There is more to the body. It is not so body-centric in terms of understanding sex work. And then it goes on to the Gomantak Marathas, and then we look at the Tawais and courtesans in Bengal. The courtesan was uniquely placed, as Urvashi Dalal shows, to leverage the new power space, for they combine the cultural refinement of the artist woman with the sexual currency, only more limited and exclusive. So in terms of spaces, we do see that they are enmeshed within the public spaces, and they have access to cultural resources, economic resources, and in a certain way there is a sense of access to public spaces, in the sense that there is no alienation per se, and definitely there is no humiliation in terms of what their body is and what they do. Then we look at the colonial period, beginning of it. I will kind of skip this. Yes. I'll come to the last part, which is the Ujjwala scheme. This is the scheme 2007, and it looks at a comprehensive scheme for prevention of trafficking and rescue, rehabilitation, and reintegration of victims of trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. Here, primarily the NGOs are supposed to kind of apply for it, where 60% funding comes from the center, 30% comes from the state, and 10% is from the agency who wants to work. It kind of does use terms of safe and secure space. It has theoretically in policy approaches it through an integrated approach, where there is a combination of shelter, livelihood options, medical support, counseling, job skills, and there is also creating awareness around rights. So in a way, the policy is looking at in some way to bridge the gaps and spaces that are there in terms of pushing to the margins and kind of bringing them within the mainstream. And one of the things that is kind of working well with this policy is the idea of viable exit options, because it was also there, some components are there, but here there are good examples coming where they are saying that there are certain kind of change that they do see, but there are a couple of places, like I think one is running in Kolkata, where they do feel that they need more support and more kind of stronger political will to be able to implement that. So having said that, I'll just conclude by saying that theoretically I do argue for a viable concept of sexual citizenship, where we look at ownership, women's ownership over their bodies, where we look at enmeshing of spaces, in terms of their access to resources, cultural resources, economic resources, also access to public spaces. So the anxiety around the moral and the sexual boundaries that continue to separate.
Thank you, Nupur. So we have 3 presentations. And all 3 reflect on this category, gender categories rather, and their situatedness within the private and public space. The public space is not accessible because it is still a very moralized space. It is a normative space based on patriarchal norms of what is the role of men and women and other genders in the society. So, but I want to say, by way of reflecting, I want to say that when we talk about these issues, there is an underlying desire or theoretical aspiration that the space, the public space, which is creating this rigidity, rigidity in terms of the boundary that exists between public and private space. By way of generating this knowledge and talking about it may should not simultaneously. The very existence of public and private spaces mean that patriarchy is operative. So before talking about these categories, we should also simultaneously be very critical and reflective of the spaces where we want to enter. Recently I was in Pune, in the University, Savitribai Phule University, to speak on genderlessness. I just want to reflect for a minute on this whole motion. This particular conference was organized by Gail Omid's Legacy Group and Women's Studies Group. And I was there with Kalpana Kandivaram, both of us were talking about it. And in that period, I read Gail quite a bit, because I'm going to speak on her. And there are certain reflections that because she worked with the most marginalized. She did not work with the sex workers, but she worked with the most marginalized Dalit women. And her position was that, which was Ambedkar's position. That is to say, we must have a democratic revolution in this country before we have any other revolution. Communist, socialist, all comes later. And one of the places where we disagree, the communist group, the trade union group, Indian Kisan Sabha, where it says that Dalit working class will not join your struggle till you form solidarity with the Dalit workers, I mean the non-Dalit workers. Since Dalit workers are still treated as untouchables, they are not given the job of handling the suit, the thread, in a mill, in a fabric mill, कपड़े का जो है फैक्ट्री, उसमें वो छू नहीं सकता था धागे को. So he said, if you cannot allow this, then how do we form solidarity? We better than struggle for rights for these people. And he said, we must look at it. He said, I'm not opposed to socialism, not opposed to feminism, but this is something that we must solve politically and historically. So, the indecent work, it has no business to be there amidst us as human beings. And it is not to be given to only one group of people who are defined as Dalits, who are defined by their, or marked by their caste. Alright. In a similar manner, the trans masculinity, they're so invisibilized that we have not even properly heard of their existence, who they are, what is their pain, how do they suffer. And there is a student who has just finished her PhD in our school, who's worked on the children of sex workers. And the stories are horrendous. It can't be shared. I can't share with you all right now. It is so difficult because they see consensual sex taking place within the same room where their mother is around. They grow up seeing all this. So what do you do with their minds? They do not want to name themselves when they come on the Facebook. They look for different names, their anonymity. They are erasing their identities. The situation is so difficult for them to exist. So these are the extremely difficult, I should say tragic, situations within which a large mass of people are living in our country. And not to mention, because there was no mention in all these three presentations about the violence. The indecent work is often accompanied by violence. Otherwise, nobody will agree to do this kind of job. That intermixing is very important. Boundaries must be loosened. maintenance of spaces in terms of boundaries is itself problematic. That is what we should reflect on. Thank you very much, and we can have now questions and we can answer. This is a difficult topic, yeah.
Yes, raise him. Yeah. Yes.
मैम मेरा सवाल सीमा मैम से है।
आप वहाँ से बोलेंगे?
मैम मेरा सवाल सीमा मैम से है। मैम मैं पूर्वी उत्तर प्रदेश के गांव से आता हूँ। मैं खुद मैम उस बच्ची की मम्मी आती हैं चाय लेकर के और उससे उसकी ट्यूशन टीचर से बोलती हैं कि अपना कप ले आइए जाकर। तो मैम उनके घर में उनका कप रखा हुआ था, वो लेकर आई, वो चाय परोसी गई उसका, फिर उन्होंने पी। तो मैम जो इस तरीके की जो अनटचेबिलिटी, क्योंकि हर दिन मतलब पोस्ट कोविड तो और ज़्यादा बदल रही है ना, कॉम्प्लेक्स होती जा रही है, तो उस चीज़ को हम आप कैसे
The larger theme of the discussion was public space. So while accessing public space remains one of the most important issues when it comes to gender politics, can we end there, or do we also need to problematize public space because of public space also leads to forms of exploitation and alienation? And another question was that the public-private dichotomy that often gets blurred when it comes to gendered politics, and one of the examples could be labor, that women working in their homes can be connected to global labor chains. So whether this dichotomy also needs further investigation and problematization. Thank you.
Nothing else questions.
Thank you for the wonderful discussion. Ma'am, I wanted to ask, either of the panel can answer, this is a general question. How do we understand self for women under neoliberalism? Because in the contemporary times, we are experiences that on one hand, we have a sway of cultural nationalism. So we have love jihad, beti bachao, beti padhao, and states bringing bills that require parents' consent for love marriages. So on one hand, we have this cultural non-self of women developing, and on the other hand, we have a sway of neoliberalism, which comes with a very shiny and polished idea of empowerment, which is pushing forward the entrepreneurial self of women. So how do we understand two very antagonistically idea of self of women existing parallelly and complementing, also contrasting each other? Thank you.
I also have a question.
Mike's
It's not
a
working, I think.
That's not working.
It's not working, I think. So yeah, so my question is basically to Shinjini. So I would like to appreciate your... yes, ma'am.
So I would like to appreciate your paper in a way, since you debunk the whole dichotomy of trans men and trans women, and you have very systematically proposed the idea of trans masculinity, which is something never discussed or in general discussion. But when it comes to your critical vantage point and critical perspective, I'm finding it a bit problematic, because again you are proposing a binary which is invisible and hypervisible. So how we are going to reflect on that? Also, I would like to say something, that there's some wonderful work by
So my question is from whole panel. Recently we have witnessed a very unusual thing in Delhi. The wrestlers were protesting, and the khaps, which are traditionally looked up as something which manages the and protects traditional power structure and hierarchy, and particularly on the question of women. But this was very unusual. And on the other side was the state, which was protecting a member of parliament. So if you see it in the larger question of gender and the changing structure and the neoliberal and the rising right wing, so how we would find the traditional power hierarchies breaking or manifesting into a new kind of normal, where we cannot they cannot be fit into a traditional understanding or traditional definitions under the power hierarchies.
Thanks. So basically, I have two concerns. I cannot really term them as queries because maybe the panelists may not reflect upon them immediately. One is with regards to our whole idea of public space and what we do with it. Even the chair commented that perhaps it's too premature now to start again asserting that binary of public versus private. I differ slightly, and which is why this concern. I saw Shinjini's paper and Nupur's paper in a certain kind of correlational way, or people who do not fall into women but would like to identify as women, the trans women or trans men. We see them as disruptors of what we perceive as ownership of public space. So in traditional norm, we see women transiting from one private to another private through a public.
Yeah.
That is the quintessential idea of public for women, traditionally. The moment there is a disruption, that means there's a working woman, perhaps not conforming to the idea of a space, which is what we are also discussing here in this panel, or perhaps not conforming to the idea of time, or the relationality with which she assumes ownership of how she connects with other people. So the moment there is a disruption here, either in the form of a sex worker or someone who's a transgender, this disruption doesn't bode well for the idea of rights, for the idea of identity, for the idea of citizenship, if you will. So how do we look at avenues of disruptions? Because I think this is where the possibility of a collective bargain, a collective demand lies actually, to consolidate all of these disruptions. So just a kind of concern, how do we do it? It's that kind of a concern. How do we capture those disruptive moments, collect them together and make a even bigger disruption, if you will. So that's one. Correlational concern again is, do we also have a gaze here within, co-thinking, co-growing space that we have? Do we have a gaze? Because I feel that in our bid to advance the cause together for all of us, we are still grappling with this issue of a gaze which is intra-gaze, which is again marginalizing one versus another. Again, that whole idea, what revolution comes first, which community gets addressed first. When we talk as feminists, are we actually talking as feminists, or there is still a distinction here? Because again, if we just connect all the three papers together, there is this link which is missing. We need to still have that kind of a link, and I think this is the right forum for that. Thank you.
Okay. So many hands.
Yeah, we have time.
Go to right and left.
Yeah, all share very interesting.
Only two more questions and then we have
To Nupur, do the sex workers take Jonathan, the sex worker of Ramayana, as their role model? If you know the story, you'll understand. That is one. Now, Seema, you talked about Dalit women, but you did not mention, you talked about that women, Dalit women speak out. Maharashtra, they are very powerful and they are Ambedkarites. Has Ambedkar influenced the Dalit women workers, men workers in Rajasthan? If so, have to change their behavior. And just one more thing, in terms of education, census, the women, Dalits are more educated compared to ST people. Has education, does it have any influence on their behavior? Thank you.
थैंक यू फॉर पैनल। मेरा एक सिंपल सा सवाल है कि जैसे फेमिनिज्म में रिफॉर्म के कई सारे प्रयास चल रहे हैं, वैसे ही एक पैरेलली नोशन चल रहा है जहाँ पर हम मेंस के राइट्स की भी बात कर रहे हैं। तो जब मेंस के राइट्स की बात को हम किस पर्सपेक्टिव देखें उसको मुझे नहीं पता, मुझे बस स्टैंड जानना है कि जैसे फॉर एग्जांपल अभी कानपुर से उसमें एक व्यक्ति ने हाफ निक्कर और बनियान पहनी हुई थी, उसको रेलवे ने पनिश किया है कि आप ऐसा पब्लिकली नहीं कर सकते। दूसरी बात, वहीं पे दिल्ली मेट्रो में एक लड़की जो मतलब शॉर्ट्स कपड़े पहने हुए थी, उसको उन्होंने कुछ नहीं किया। इसका मतलब जो हम मतलब एक सेंस में, तो जब हम पब्लिक डोमेन की बात करते हैं, तो यहाँ पर कपड़ों को लेकर और पब्लिक एक्सेप्टेबिलिटी को लेकर ये फेमिनिस्ट अप्रोच क्या है, फेमिनिस्ट इंटरप्रिटेशन क्या है, क्या ये चैलेंज है फेमिनिस्ट के लिए कि हाँ हम मेंस की राइट बात नहीं कर रहे, क्योंकि हम जब जेंडर न्यूट्रलिटी की बात कर रहे हैं तो वहाँ पे पब्लिक डोमेन में मेंस राइट और फीमेल राइट्स अलग अलग क्यों दिखते हैं? थैंक यू सो मच।
Okay. Third was not allowed to enter in ISC.
I know that. ISC had this.
Very bad.
This is a question for Seema ma'am. So how do we challenge the institution of merit in the educational spaces with regards to Dalit feminism? Keeping that in mind. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for this opportunity, ma'am. This question is to Shinjini, ma'am. I have primarily two questions. So, since you're talking about gender dysphoria, they go through that same problem, but they are also, medication, but they are 17 and they are in their primary ages of growth. So I wanted to know what are your opinions on it, whether they should get, if we need to bring age as a criteria to understand ourselves better, or do we can, if we have a solution to a problem, can we take it at the earlier stage? And the second question is with regard to, it could be a basic question, but as in a student life, I have known students who who identify as a queer person, they feel better and secure to express themselves in the streets of North Campus than in the streets of an off-campus college. So, and a friend of mine did a research, which was a primary data collection research, in which he found out that there's also an economic disparity when it comes to these North Campus and off-campus colleges. Like students in North Campus or South Campus colleges come from a better privileged background, while in off-campus colleges we noticed with regard to that research that they are not from much privileged background. So I want to link this idea that even within the queer community, can we say those who are economically well off at the ladder, they feel more secure to express not much economically privileged. Thank you.
धनंजय भाई बहुत बार
This will be the last.
Thank, I'm audible, I guess.
Okay, you are.
Thank you. This is to Nupur. How do you link this, the sexual rights of sex workers with the concept of heteronormativity? Because mostly, but what happened to Brahminical? And when we are saying that we can have cultural resources in terms of sex workers, then I don't think that the Brahminical heteronormativity and the sex workers' right would converge anywhere. So while problematizing heteronormativity of colonialism, I think Brahminism also to be problematized vis-a-vis sex workers' right. One second, just last point, because there were multiple nuisance commissions during colonial and Mumbai on pollutions. But the idea of pollution in this case was predated this public nuisance commission, and that was very much coded and in practice of social structure of Indian society.
So we have a whole lot of questions. So should I start with Shinjini since you are the first speaker, and we'll go with this.
Sanjana has had one question.
So one more?
Sanjana has.
One more question.
So far?
Sanjana.
Okay, Sanjana, go ahead. We can't see anything from here.
So my question is to Nupur ma'am. I really liked your formulation of looking at sex workers in an intersection of space, body and agency. I was wondering if while we talk about expression of one's autonomy in the sense of having an alternate identity. So, let's say for porn stars, online porn stars, create a separate persona for themselves in order to assert their own autonomy as practice autonomy. So I was wondering, how would you draw a synergy between these alternate identities that exist, the person being that person, and then also the person being a separate identity for themselves in order to express their autonomy. So does it then that we have to inevitably take a very layered understanding of that space, body and agency together?
No, I think I must record the quality of intervention of these three papers. They really touch frontier areas, issues which open up new insights, all three, and that's what links all the three papers. They question the prevailing categories, which really were either binaries themselves or reactions to binaries, particularly public-private, and traditionally constructed moral and immoral. And then when you, and intersectionality, the deeper dimensions of intersectionality, each one of them has brought out. I'll be very brief. One more point. I think as the intensity and complexity of oppression gets revealed, and we become aware, as these three papers illustrate, and many other presentations did. I'm sure the last session would have done that also. Our categories are losing capacity to capture them. I mean, I have been old enough to witness the transition from pre-neoliberal vocabulary of oppression, inequality, exploitation, domination, to inclusion, exclusion. And we have now, I still take them with a pinch of salt, but I think 99% of the literate population have adopted that vocabulary of inclusion, exclusion. Changing the intensity and newspapers. Similarly, the talk of the margin. So these are oppressed people, oppressed sections and dimensions of oppression, and we have a whole range of words to describe oppression, to define domination, deprivation, killing, negation, so many things. If you just translate, don't translate, but engage in this discourse in your own languages, Indian languages, you realize. But look, the term at least was respectful, you see. And so on. I'm just giving you one example. Therefore, be conscious of this new discourse on equality and inequality and oppression, which have captured. I mean, I remember how the French sociologists suggested this, the neoliberal Washington consensus advocates of social science, and led by the US Social Science Research Council and the Ford Foundation, how they propagated the neoliberal vocabulary, government, civil society, inclusion, exclusion, marginalization, to replace oppression, exploitation, and things like that. So I think particularly the young generation should know this history of discourse on oppression. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, number of questions, and we have about 20 minutes. now we can let up to 6 बजे या 6 बजे तक रुकते हैं, ठीक है? Let's have it full house discussion. We can ask IIC to give us a little more time. 6 बजे तक हम अपनी डिस्कशन करेंगे. तो
नहीं कुछ संजना बोलो.
हाँ बस
She's saying maximum 10 minutes we have. चलना भी है.
So the questions I got, I actually see them very interrelated. And I would also like to, first of all, just talk about the limit to my research and theoretical engagement. This is precisely the invisibility I'm talking about and the process of invisibilization of the transmasculine experience, that our experiences are categorized within the concept of a woman, in most cases of a cis woman. So we might face a similar problem, but the way we understand our problem and the way we understand that violence depends on our own identities and how we locate ourselves within this social structure. So the mixing of categories and the transmasculine experience being considered a subset of a woman, and hypervisibility I'm talking about is in the sense of violence. We are seeing a record number of violence against transmasculine people right now. And even in India, if we try to take an example closer to home, I remember the case of in Garima Griha, which is a home, like a shelter home for transgender people in Gurugram, where a few transmasculine people were dragged out on the street in the middle of the night when they opposed a member of the shelter home being taken away forcefully. So that is the sort of hypervisibility, and I am not projecting both of these things as oppositional. I'm actually saying they're existing together, but what parts of us are getting hypervisibilized and what parts of us are getting invisibilized. So there's a certain violence to it, and we need to explore more in that arena. Secondly, there we can also look at intersection with other movements as well. Secondly, coming to the question of gender dysphoria and the access to medical care. So as for now, we actually have medical care like hormone replacement hormone replacement treatment only for adults above the age of 18. So even if someone who is 14 or 15 wants to access this right now, cannot without their parental consent, and it's a long process and it's quite expensive as well. And when it comes to the economic disparity within the queer community as well, first of all, even within the elite college spaces that we have, and the North Campus versus South Campus versus off-campus binary, there are a lot of people who come from marginalized spaces and identities. We don't see that sort of assertion, maybe, or even presentation. And to afford that presentation and lifestyle, there's some money that is required, right? So there is definitely an economic disparity, and that disparity further gets, it gets to you if you want to access medical care or if you want to transition, particularly within the trans community. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Lots of questions here. I would like to start with ma'am's question. Itself is the answer, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's impact in Maharashtra, how we would almost all the movement, Dalit movement or Panther movement, or we say the women movement started itself from Maharashtra, and people are much aware, and the impact we can see in the North India also. But again, one question: does education have an impact on such discriminatory behavior? So I would like to examples. Yes, education can be a very strong tool to eradicate such kind of discriminatory behavior based on caste and gender, but this is in our mindset in which we are living for a long time. So it is not easy to eradicate it when first Dalit President of India, when he visited Uttar Pradesh, then the seat was it was in newspaper, and again the example of Mayawati ji, she is the chief minister, three times chief minister, and she is called as very abusive language like कि वो आ गई हैं बहन जी, or calling by caste name. So caste is in blood and mind, so it is not much easy to eradicate that. So if we have education and much sensitization over such kind of education, and very sensitively handle these issues in our educational institution, then it will be possible. And other thing, by the movement, if we are indulging people in such kind of movement, then it will be much easy to eradicate such kind of things. And one question is that public domain में जो men की rights की बात जो की थी, ये बहुत quite obvious है कि जहाँ पर भी women की बात होती है तो there is a insecurity about the male rights की उनकी बात नहीं हो रही है. So this has to be very understand that feminism is not talking about of women in every space. So it is not cutting down the men's rights when we are talking. We are just so we are just trying to address the inequality which are practicing in the society based on caste and gender to the feminist lens or with the Dalit women perspective. So we are just trying to come out those discriminations. If I'm not wrong, ma'am can put more insights on that. I think one question was two classes. Barbers are not agree to cut down the hairs of Dalit people, and in restaurant there are the two-glass system, दो cup और utensil वहाँ पे रखे जाते हैं for the Dalit people. So बहुत सारी इस तरह की practices है जिसको हमें count down करने की जरूरत है. I think यही क्वेश्चन थे खाप पंचायत और थैंक यू.
Yes, thank you for those very important questions, and it needs deeper reflections too. But I'll just try. So I think maybe because in my anxiety to just say whatever I wanted to, the whole idea to begin with public-private dichotomy was to actually critically engage with it, right? And the fact that the public-private discourse, the divide, has largely informed the discourse on sex work in India. Whereas then my next argument was, which is also in a way answering to Rityusha and you, that and then my argument was that how the debate on sex work is actually disrupting the entire discourse in politics of public-private. That is why I put up what Ratna Kapoor had to say, the idea that how we want to invisibilize sex workers in public domain. So those, I think, that was the line of argument that I wanted to take, because that is, we in contemporary feminist politics, we know that there's a lot of dismantling of the public-private dichotomy, and yet yet we need to begin somewhere in terms of critically engaging with it. So that was one. Then about the self, I think we have had those discussions in classrooms, which is about, classroom and higher education and a feminist theory class and a class on gender politics are those spaces where then we enter into a dialogue, we enter into understanding who we are as women, as citizens of the world, as citizens of the state, and therefore the whole understanding that we discuss of informed agency and empowered agency, and thus linking to the question of if it is all right to actually be able to express oneself through alternate identities. I don't know, in my personal view, it could be the beginning, but it may not be what we want to achieve. We want to be ourselves. We want to be in terms of who we are. So, as a lot of writers, pehle aata tha anonymous hai ya not known. We all know that anonymous was actually a woman writer. So that's not something which I think, if that's the case, then we need to move further where we can just be ourselves and express ourselves in that way. Khap Panchayat question, I think academically, I can just say, and I still need to read more about it. But Khap Panchayat question can be seen from a perspective of benevolent patriarchy, something which is found in traditional feudal systems. And we can, of course, critically engage, but I'm just giving you one point where we can kind of start. Yes, what else? I think question of sex workers' rights and heteronormativity, I think, those are important questions, and again, I think that is where, the anxiety around seeing sex workers as encroaching that heteronormative space within the public domain. And it also doesn't come from the idea of valorizing public domain. The thing is, I just want to go wherever I want to go. It's not kind of, I want to just be, and now, Valerie that the politics of time and space to go. It should not be determined in terms of your parents में कुछ होता है तो वो जगह safe है क्योंकि वहाँ पे women हैं, right? That is the kind of notion. So I'm a citizen of this country. I can go where the hell I want to go. So it's not about, and that could include public space, that include cinema hall, that can include any place. And any restriction is a violation of who I am, my right, my fundamental right. So and therefore when we look at sex workers, I think they have been further marginalized. So it is also not looking at in terms of essentializing public-private domain, but definitely recognizing the tensions there. And thus, the whole understanding around, heteronormativity and breaking those, and that is why Vidyusha put it very well, that they're actually disruptors in so many ways, and therefore we don't want to see them. That is why we want to invisibilize them, because we don't want to disrupt, our, normative, moral, sexual boundaries, in this. So yeah, I think those are the things that come to my mind. For the men, yes, we love men.
But also, don't forget that men are also in the profession of prostitution. They're called gigolo. We have not reflected on that. So feminization of sex work is one part of the whole story. It's a tremendously growing trend in the West and also in India, where men are offering services. Thank you very much. I think we had a wonderful session. Given that this is a difficult subject, because it actually touches private sphere. Not public and again, I'm going to sort of announce. Thank you very much for everyone.
This side.
So, thank you so much, ma'am, for chairing this session. Panelists, coordinator of the session.